My name is Andy McKinley, and as head of the School of PPLS, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Nick Gisborne's inaugural lecture this evening. And this is apparently one in an occasional series because next week we'll be having one of Nick's colleagues delivering her inaugural lecture. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Nick's many friends, supporters and research colleagues who have joined him here tonight, and I know some of you have made extensive travel arrangements to be here. I'd especially like to welcome Nick's wife Caroline and his sons Tom and Alex, who are here with us this evening. After Nick's presentation, there will be some time to ask him questions in his talk, and there will also be an opportunity to talk with him at the informal reception, which is going to be held at the end of this presentation. As many of you know, Nick studied at University College London, taking his PhD there in 1996. He's well travelled, having held positions in Hong Kong as well as at Cambridge University before joining us in 2002. Today he holds a chair in linguistics here, and his research focuses on syntax and lexical semantics. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about what's grammar for. And with that said, I shall hand over to Nick.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Andy, for that introduction. It's a real privilege to be here today giving this talk, and thank you to everyone for coming as well. It's even more of a privilege to have an audience. My topic today comes from some words of wisdom of my older sons, and they date back about 10 years or so. Sorry, Tom. And these were the words of wisdom. We were sitting around the table having dinner, and at some point in a lull in the conversation, Tom fixed me with a rather beady eye and said, "So, Dad, what is it you teach in that university of yours then?" And I was about to launch into an account of what it is I teach in this university when Caro chipped in for me and I think was day-saving. She said, "Dad teaches linguistics, you know, it's like word science." And I had this little flush of real pleasure. I thought, that's marvellous, that's exactly what I do. I do word science, that's absolutely fantastic. But Tom wasn't to be suppressed, and he turned around and the beady gaze was still there, all beady, and said, "Yeah, right. Is that like grammar?" And I had the register wrong, and I thought that he was actually interested and didn't realise that there was contempt in his tone of voice, and said, "Yes, that's exactly what I do." You know, big beam on my face. I teach grammar, that's my subject. Man, is that boring. So, today is my answer to Tom, no, it's not. What's grammar for? Well, there are several different conceptions of grammar. There's a cultural conception which says that it's a code that people have to be taught so they can master writing, and that there's right and there's wrong in grammar. Related, there's an educational notion of grammar. It's something that children have to learn, perhaps for its own sake, perhaps because it helps with writing, and perhaps it's relevant to studying modern languages and so on. And then there's the linguist's notion of grammar, which is that it's the combinatory system which makes language work. We humans have an unconscious knowledge of the grammar of the languages that we speak to each other, and here I am, vibrating the atmosphere, creating new thoughts in your head, and part of what makes it possible for those new thoughts to arise in your head is this unconscious grammar that we share. By and large, these different conceptions of grammar belong to different communities, but there is some overlap between them, and I'm going to explore some of these notions and some of this overlap. So the talk has the following structure. I start off by looking at grammar in culture, so I look at the notion of prescriptivism, which I'm going to relate to writing, standardization, and also group membership. Then I'm going to look at grammar in schools and how it plays out in schools. Then I'm going to talk about what a linguist means by grammar, followed by a case study of relative clauses. Relative clauses are going to occur a little bit earlier on as well. And then I'm going to wrap up with an envoy, which I've called "So What Should We Tell the Children?" Remember, this talk is Tom's fault. Tom's no longer a child. He needs you to know that. Okay, culture. There's a strong cultural sense that there's right and wrong in language, and commentators frequently appointed are entitled to comment on others' linguistic behaviour, but this isn't necessarily where it begins. In the preface to his dictionary, Johnson, I'm not going to go through the quote, but Johnson is concerned with how he establishes a standard. How does he determine what the orthography should be and what the actual semantics of the words that he's defining ought to be? And he's exercised because it's not established for him, and he has to take the responsibility of establishing it. Chesterfield was Johnson's patron. In the plan for the dictionary, which is in a letter from Johnson to Chesterfield, there are discussions about what should appear in this dictionary. Chesterfield himself wrote a series of letters to his son which play out like a conduct manual, and he talks about grammar in his own letters, and in those letters he's concerned that his son should really have mastery of the modern languages that he's learning. So the study of grammar for Chesterfield is to do with expert control over French and German and Italian and Spanish, and showing that you have expert control over those languages. Johnson and Chesterfield both work from authority. They identify authors they think give them good examples, but for them, the study of language is part of the process of standardization, of course, and they're in a period of standardization. It's about literacy and the mastery of literacy. Chesterfield was very ambitious for his son, and Johnson had a desire, if you like, to establish some kind of standard that would work for other people, but they weren't gatekeepers. They weren't admitting others into a culture. They weren't saying that these are the norms that you have to subscribe to. They were part of the creation of this standard variety. They were both in the business of exploring what they thought made up good examples and recommending that those examples should be followed. Johnson's very careful to establish the temporal bounds of his authorities, so when he's looking back through the history of English writing, he establishes Sir Philip Sidney as his earliest authority, the boundary beyond which he makes few excursions. But that's not necessarily how grammar in culture plays out today. Lots of people have style guides. Style guides are a jolly good thing. Style guides make for consistency in publications, and people who publish take an economic risk. They need to have consistency in what they're putting out into the public. Style guides can make for better writing in some cases, and lots of style guides are perfectly sensible. The Guardian, by the way, has a lowercase t because that's what their style guide tells you they should have. The Economist has an uppercase one because that's what their style guide insists on. Now, they have excellent style guides, good guidance for writers and so on. But in linguistics, we find that the journal Linguistic Inquiry, has a very odd restriction. To tell you about this restriction, I need to establish the difference between a restrictive relative clause and a non-restrictive relative clause. So a non-restrictive relative clause is like the first indented example there. Conservative politicians who are rare in Scotland often don't rebel. So the fact that conservative politicians are rare in Scotland is just an addendum to the noun phrase conservative politicians. It doesn't tell you anything new about them. It doesn't restrict the set of conservative politicians. There just aren't that many in Scotland, and that's that. A restrictive relative clause is like who rebelled. In the second example here, the MPs who rebelled came from both major parties, and here, who rebelled restricts the set of entities that can be referred to by the noun the MPs. Okay, so there's a set of 600 and whatever it is MPs, and the ones who rebelled comes down to the 20-odd Tories who rebelled yesterday over the high-speed train thing that was being voted on yesterday. So it gives you a very small subset. So that's the difference between a restrictive and a non-restrictive relative clause. Linguistic Inquiry introduces this particular rule. They say when the head noun is non-human, use that to introduce restrictive relative clauses and use which to introduce non-restrictive relative clauses, which is kind of odd because there's nothing wrong with the house which we bought. That's a perfectly grammatical utterance of English. If you talk about the house which we bought, it's absolutely fine. So Linguistic Inquiry, a linguistics journal, has got a really arbitrary usage rule embedded in its style sheet. It's got nothing to do with English grammar, because it's fine to use a WH word in a restrictive relative clause. And restrictive relative clauses are where my research lies. I'm working on relative clauses with Rob Truswell, and one of the things that Rob and I have discovered is that these WH words of English enter the relative clause system by being associated with restrictives. So the LI style guide is at odds with both the facts and the history of English. Okay? So the WH words are there because of the history of English in restrictive relative clauses, and linguistic inquiry is telling its authors not to use a system which is mandated by the history of English. This sort of thing is quite common in cultural notions of grammar. It's people telling other people what they should or shouldn't do with their language, irrespective of the actual grammaticality. Now, my colleague Jeff Pullen wrote a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education called Lying About Writing, about a style guide that includes these different precepts. There are several more precepts than this, and I'm not going to go over them, and I'm certainly not going over the 50 or so that William Safire came up with. I want to talk about the very last one in my list here. It is wrong to ever split an infinitive, because that's another one of these shibboleths that crops up time after time. And yet it's nothing to do with the grammar of English. And here's why. Take the heading of the slide. How not to raise a rapist. This is a headline from The Guardian on the 29th of October last year. And it made my eyes bleed when I first read it. And the reason it made my eyes bleed when I first read it is that I couldn't believe that anybody would publish an article in The Guardian giving advice on how to raise a rapist. Okay? Because the default interpretation of how not to raise a rapist goes something like this. You've got a little rapist, and there's a good way of raising him, and there's a bad way of raising him, and the article is going to tell you about the bad way of raising your little rapist. Okay? And that's really quite unpleasant. It's patently not what the sub-editor meant. The sub-editor meant something like how to avoid raising a rapist. Okay? If you don't get my interpretation, compare it with how not to roast a chicken. How not to roast a chicken suggests there's a good way of roasting a chicken and a bad way of roasting a chicken, and you're being told about the bad way. What's the problem? Well, the problem is to do with the placement of the word not. Not is a negative adverb. Negative adverbs are scope-taking words. And in how not to raise a rapist, the problem is caused when the word not has scope over how. So what how not to raise a rapist means is not the way to raise a rapist, okay, as in the bottom of the slide here. There are other issues. Raise can mean bring into existence, or it can mean bring up, but, and that's part of the confound. But the issue here is really quite simple. The author meant the word not to have narrow scope. They meant not just to scope over the predicate raise a rapist. And because they put it in the wrong place, because they were following a non-rule of English grammar, they said something that was really quite acutely offensive. And I don't understand why. Because the Guardian style guide says that it's absolutely fine to split an infinitive. Well, not only is it absolutely fine to split an infinitive, but obviously sometimes it's the grammatically right thing to do. And here's an example. Of course, when we look at things like this, we might ask ourselves where these prescriptive rules come from, and they come from self-appointed authorities. Self-appointed authority on this occasion is some random 19th century clergyman called Henry Alford. Henry Alford, as far as I can see, had very few merits. He really did enjoy telling other people what to do. He was a member of a society that told people how they should build churches, for example, despite the more or less 1,000-year-long history in these islands of building churches by the time he was making his recommendations. In the relevant paragraph from his book, The Queen's English, which is up here, he says that his authority for asserting that people shouldn't split infinitives comes from common usage. Okay? Comes from common usage. Well, it's a pity that he was a hopelessly inattentive reader of English. We can't poll 19th century speakers of English, but given that Alford is concerned with the written language, we can look at that. And people have been splitting infinitives in English, assuming that they existed in the 14th century, since Wycliffe, and a century later since Tyndall. And Wycliffe and Tyndall were translating the most important book in their culture, which is the Bible. According to Kerm, in his monumental grammar of 1931, which is a jolly long time ago, so it really ought to have killed the shibboleth by now, all of these people split infinitives. My top list of people comes from before Alford was writing, and my bottom list of people comes from after Alford was writing, but there's a lot of names up there, and a lot of those names are respected authors in English. Shakespeare split infinitives. An authority, Webster's International Dictionary, did in 1921. Even Henry James split infinitives, and most people will tell you that if you want a prose stylist to model your prose on, then you should look to Henry James. He's the man. Split infinitives. So, we might ask ourselves, why would anyone ignore good sense and put an adverb in the wrong place and create an offensive utterance because of a truly ignorant rule? And we might ask ourselves how such rules come to have currency. Because it's not where the work of standardization began. The work of standardization began, as Johnson said in his letter to Chesterfield, our syntax, therefore, is not to be taught by general rules, but by special precedents. And if Alford was actually looking at the precedents, he wouldn't have said something stupid. We've got two different things converging, I think. One is that there's a process of standardization, which is related to mass literacy, publishing, and education. And that's a cultural phenomenon with lots of different factors feeding into it. But we also have a kind of cultural anxiety that goes something like, how do I show I know the code? And in these phenomena, we might ask ourselves where grammar fits. I think it's true that knowing about grammar can help produce better writing. But then I think that what we say is grammar had better be true. And I think that the prescriptivists show us that they don't actually care about grammar. So my first point is that these prescriptivists in their culture are actually inimical to grammar. So yesterday, when the Idler Academy announced, as it did, that they were about to hand out their bad grammar awards, and announced that this was for people who care about grammar, they had it exactly arsewise. That caused a wince in the domestic part of the audience. My point is that some of these prescriptive shibboleths have to exist in ignorance of grammar. Take How to Raise a Rapist. The grammar says that to get the intended reasoning, you have to put not in between to and raise. But the prescriptivist insists on a structure that gives the wrong analysis. In other cases, there can be two ways of expressing something. For example, this is the house which we bought versus this is the house that we bought. They're both grammatical, but here the prescriptivist, the author of the LI style sheet, insists on an arbitrary choice. And of course there's a third case where there are dialectal variants which are stigmatized, including, for example, should of versus should have. That's, I think, a childhood acquisition form which is becoming dialectalized. So that's the end of my section on culture. I return to it in What Should We Tell the Children? Now to education. What's taught in schools and what should be. The example sentences on the screen come from a book called Nelson Grammar. I went to Google Books, I opened Nelson Grammar in Google Books at random, and I found this exercise. It instructs the class to copy out the adverb phrases from this list here, to add a verb to them, to add any other word that you need to make them into sentences, and to make them into sentences. There is a Mars bar for anybody who can find an adverb phrase in that lot. And I don't have a Mars bar on me. Before the first lesson is a prepositional phrase. We'll meet at the corner is a sentence. In front of the cinema is a prepositional phrase. Gasping for breath is a verb phrase. Simon rang the bell repeatedly is a sentence. You must find that letter is a sentence. It is impossible to do the exercise that these kids are being asked to do. The only thing that actually looks anything like an adverb phrase, if you'll admit single word phrases, is the word repeatedly here. But it's already in a sentence. So it's really impossible to do the exercise that's required. Okay, so here's an exercise that asks students to do something that's impossible, that's useless, because it's impossible to see what the purpose of this exercise could be, and which is boring. So it's no wonder that I was told that what I do in this university of mine is boring. It's also really hard to understand why anyone would write such materials as this or teach them. Most people want to teach things that have meaning. one of the things I find in my own classes is that if I'm teaching something that I'm returning to after a while, I might find myself coming out with the standard wisdom on this topic, and I might find myself caught out by not understanding why the standard wisdom is the way it is. I'm sure this happens to all of us at some point as we're teaching. And that creates a problem in the classroom, of course, because then you have to decide whether you're going to confess your problem to your students or whether you're going to do it after the event, and all of those sorts of things happen. But the reason that situation happens is that we want to teach things that are meaningful. And in a primary school curriculum, you want your pupils to be familiar with the textures of language. Of course you do. You want your pupils to be familiar and confident in talking about language as well. That's also really important. But what you teach has to be clear, it has to be purposeful, it has to be accessible, and it has to make sense to the child. It has to be available to the child at the relevant stage of their education to make use of in some way. And what we've just seen is utterly egregious. But there are things that grammar can do in schools. It can usefully frame modern language instruction. So, for example, you can use the terms of art to make it straightforward to explain to a 13 or 14-year-old kid that you're teaching German to that German has this verb second property where in a main clause the finite verb is always the second constituent in that clause. And if you can use terms like finite verb and constituent, you can say useful things to those kids. You can also, as long as you can talk about nouns and adjectives, explain usefully to kids learning French that typically, there's a subset of cases where this isn't the case, but typically nouns in French follow the noun that they modify. It took me a long time to get to grips with that particular fact of French because I learned French from a textbook called Le Bon Chemin. But never mind that. We can also use grammar to help our students improve their writing because we can use it to get them to understand the choices they make as they're organising their prose. Now, here's a really simple example from real culture. The first sentence of Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of a fortune, is it fortune or large fortune, doesn't matter, must be in want of a wife. Okay? It is a truth universally acknowledged. Your main predicate there is a truth universally acknowledged. If you took that clause and you put it at the front of a sentence, that a man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife is a truth universally acknowledged, you get something which is really horrible to process. But if you extrapose it, so you put it in the subject position, you take that clause and you move it to the back end of the sentence, you get something which is way easier to read, way more stylish, way easier to process. And one of the things I do in first and second year encounters with my students is teach them about things like this, which really can improve how they write. These things are useful bits of grammar to teach older students, not school kids necessarily. And it's worth doing. The other thing we can do with teaching grammar is teach science, because as I think I'm about to show, I hope I'm about to show, doing grammar is a kind of scientific inquiry in some ways. And we have the marvellous advantage here of not needing to break a test tube or chop up a chicken fetus or anything else that we might not want to do. But to do these things, we need to understand how grammar is important, why it matters, and what it means. So this means that we need to talk about grammar from the point of view of the linguist. So, linguistics. Grammar for the linguist. Grammar is the combinatory system of language. It minimally involves, it arguably involves more than this, but this is a minimal set of things that it has to involve. Phonology, so that's the grammar of the sound system. Morphology, that's the grammar of word structure. Syntax, that's the grammar of sentences. And semantics, and that's the grammar of meaning composition. There are some really complex interactions between these subdomains. And you could take me and any of my colleagues who work on these things and put us in a room together. There are two of my colleagues who work directly on these things in this room today, and the three of us don't agree on what these things ought to look like. And that's because we don't know. We each have our hunches, and we run hypotheses over our hunches, and we see what comes out of it. But really, there's a lot of argument about the many competing proposals that you find. Grammarians arguing has been recorded all the way back to Horace, who came out with the line grammatici certant, grammarians will be disputatious, I think that means. But Horace was behind the curve. If you go back to ancient Babylonia, they used to have grammarian competitions, even with prizes for the losers. Now there's a society we should want to live in. Although there's a lot of debate, though, among those of us who work on the structure of language, we have a lot of agreement about what the phenomena are, and we also are pretty clear that we know what the consequences are of making various theoretical choices. So if Ronnie, for example, makes a move and I make a different move, we're both quite clear about what the consequences of our own choices will be and what the consequences of each other's will be. So there's scope for agreement as well as the disputatious stuff. One of the first things I teach when I teach first or second year syntax is that so-called object pronouns can be syntactic subjects. In each of the sentences in one on the screen, the word him is the subject of the predicate to leave. He is the leaver in each of those cases. Okay? And there are various diagnostics one can run to demonstrate that. The sentences aren't all exactly the same there. There are differences between them, and those differences are to do with other properties that you find. For example, him is not also the subject of want, so you can't passivize it. You can't say he is wanted to leave. That really is ungrammatical. It's impossible for any native speaker of English to come out with a sentence like he is wanted to leave. On the other hand, this doesn't apply to expect. You can all say he is expected to leave. Likewise, you can all say, he was persuaded to leave. There's a difference, however, between expect and persuade, which is that with expect, him is not semantically marked by expect in any way, but with persuade, him is semantically marked by the verb. And that's also simple to demonstrate. We can simply work out the difference between I expected him to eat the chips. I expected the chips to be eaten by him. They both mean the same thing. But I persuaded him to eat the chips does not mean the same thing as I persuaded the chips to be eaten by him. Okay? So there are differences between these structures as well. And I think the full set of differences between structures like this was actually first established at MIT in the 1960s. These are fairly recent discoveries in the history of studying grammar, given that grammarians were being disputatious in ancient Babylonia. So the examples on that previous slide mean the following things. The first thing they mean is that objective case doesn't necessarily go together with a direct object. And the second thing they mean is there can be mismatches between syntax and semantics, because these three sentences had the same kind of structure, or expect and persuade had the same structure, syntactically apparently, but different meaning structures built into them. And a lot of the work that we do in the study of grammar as linguists is in establishing and trying to explain our theory of mismatch between one subpart of the grammar and another. These mismatches between semantics and syntax are rife. We spend a lot of time trying to understand them. And we've already come across a mismatch, actually, in how not to raise a rapist, although I think here the mismatch was because of the incompetence of the sub. In the not scoping over how is even in the wrong position to sort of scope over how, if you like. You might expect it to be on the outside of how on the left, but it's absolutely in the wrong position to scope narrowly over raise, if that's the interpretation that's meant. So, how do these systems interact? And we don't have an a priori answer. We have to make various research decisions and play them out. So one decision it's possible to make, and people do make this decision, is to assert that language is some kind of Platonic abstract system, and we can simply model it in the most mathematically precise way we possibly can, and that will be a useful thing to do. Okay? Another way we can look at it is to say that the grammar of human languages must be constrained by the monkey brain. We've got these not particularly good brains sitting behind our skulls, and so the grammar that we have has to work within the limitations of the brains that we've got. There are other choices that you can make. The set of possible choices is enormous, and the way they fit together can become massively complex. But these are my choices. I work with a so-called dependency theory of grammar, and it makes sense to me to see grammar as a symbolic network which can be formalized, which can be set up to analyze the various linguistic phenomena we need to analyze, and which is consistent with a network view of human cognition. On this theory, an analysis that I want him to leave would involve words and simple pairwise relationships between words. So the diagram says that want has a subject, and the subject of want is I, that want has an excomp. Excomp means open complement, and the open complement of want itself has a subject, him. That to has an excomp, which is an open complement, and leave then also has a subject, which is him. So it's a very simple system, but it leads to a lot of complexity in terms of some of the particular analyses, because we have similar analyses for word structure and likewise similar analyses for meaning structure as well. Excuse me, I really never wear jackets. And indeed, I think the last time I wore a tie, it was a funeral. I'm just going to roll the sleeves up, it's okay, really. It stops here. Well, here. So relative clauses. I've been working on the history of relative clauses with Rob Truswell, and I'm delighted to say that Rob Truswell is coming to Edinburgh as a Chancellor's Fellow this summer. So that, I think, is brilliant news for LEL and PPLS, and it's super brilliant news for me. Relative clauses. Why look at relative clauses? Relative clauses are a way in which we can modify a noun with a clause, and they're a useful way of modifying a noun because they express a whole proposition. But relative clauses are really complex, and they're a real mess. They're not just messy in English, they're messy in other languages as well. I mean, one falsehood I was told at school was that I should study Latin because it's more logical than English. That's just not the case. Not if you take their relative clauses anyway, which are even horribler than English relative clauses. This is because the relative clauses of Latin are like the relative clauses of the other Indo-European languages. They're the messy output of a complex process of cultural evolution. My case study here will show you how relative clauses are a mess in the Indo-European languages, and I'm going to try and explain how they came about through a local case study in the history of English. But to do that, we need a bit of a toolkit. However, before we get to the toolkit, some hypotheses. And the hypotheses are just to talk about how we might argue about grammar. So this theory of grammar I work with, word grammar, has a very simple ontology with vanishingly few primitives in the system. One of the primitives is a, so that means is an instance of, so that's a classification relationship. It has an argument relationship and a value relationship for handling mathematical functions. A before or after relationship, they're just converses, so you pick one, and a quantity relation, and that's pretty much it. It looks like an artificial intelligence knowledge representation system, and that's not surprising, it's embedded in that particular tradition. In word grammar, a grammatical change would involve the language learner, whoever that might be, inducing a different mental network from the mental network that their model has. And these changes would be changes in the symbolic network, particularly surrounding lexical items and lexical items in hierarchies. The reason for this is that the grammar is merely a hierarchy of lexical items and a hierarchy of the relationships between lexical items. It's a very local system, and it's it's a very local model of representation. And to the extent that there's a grammatical system, and I come back to the notion of a grammatical system later on, the grammatical system is emergent. It's not proper to the theory. There are no meta rules or anything like this. The toolkit for relative clauses. The first part of the toolkit is that we need to distinguish between free relatives and headed relatives. So a free relative is like the example in 2a. I'll have what she's having. What she's having is a free relative because it's a relative clause that doesn't have a noun that it modifies, that occupies the object slot of the verb have. Okay, so that's a free relative. A headed relative is like the example in 2b, where the relative clause that she's having modifies the noun thing. Okay, so that's a headed relative. It's got this external head here, this noun. So that's the difference between those two things. And here's a representation of the difference between free relatives and headed relatives. It's pretty simple. With the free relative, the head of the relative is this WH word what here, and in the headed relative, the head is external over here, and the word that is a dependent of thing. Okay, so it's just a simple representation, but I hope it's mnemonic. Another dimension of structure. When we look at relative clauses, we think in terms of fillers and gaps. So the gap is the position within the relative clause where there would be a word or a phrase in a canonical clause. So in I'll have what she's having, there's a gap in the object position, okay, which is shown by the underline there in the example. And what is the filler which occupies this gap? In the headed relative, I'll have the thing that she's having. Again, there's a gap in the object position of have, and that is the filler. So we need, as part of our toolkit, to think about what fillers can be. Are they WH words like what? Are they the word that? Or can they be zeros? Because it's possible to have so-called zero relatives. I'll have the thing she's having. And we also need to think about what the gap can be. Is it the subject? Is it the object? Is it some other grammatical function? So fillers and gaps and the grammatical functions of gaps are part of our toolkit at this point. We also need to distinguish between two different word classes, which I'm calling relative specifiers and relative complementizers. These terms of art are Rob's fault because he works with a different theory from mine and he won in the vocabulary war here. A relative specifier is one of these WH words like who, which, or how, and they can be phrasal. So the example in 4, the kid whose sister told you off, whose sister is a phrase, okay? There's only one relative complementizer in English, and the relative complementizer of English is the invariant word that, which is never phrasal. So there's a 4-way typology of relative clauses involving these things. You can have the food she ate with 0. You can have the food which she ate with a relative specifier. You can have the food that she ate with a relative complementizer. And although you can't do this in contemporary varieties of English, in older varieties of English, you could have both the relative specifier which and the relative complementizer that in the food which that she ate. Plenty of examples of that kind in Chaucer. So, although which that is no longer attested, all 4 variants occurred in Middle English. We're rejecting the standard terms for relative specifier and relative complementizer, which are relative pronoun and relative particle, because they're misleading. The word that looks like a pronoun, and there are papers arguing that it is, and you'll find that Arabic has relative complementizers which inflect. So that's why we're avoiding those particular terms. Okay, the next bit of the toolkit that we need to be able to talk about these relative clauses is the accessibility hierarchy, which was first discussed by Ed Keenan and Bernard Cumry in a paper in Language in 1977. And the idea here is that subject gaps are easier to form relatives on than object gaps. And the lower down this hierarchy you get, the harder it is to form a relative. So it's easy to form a relative at the top, and it's really hard down at the bottom. In languages with inflections, the relative specifier inflects, not necessarily, but in the kind of language I'm talking about, the relative specifier inflects in relation to the grammatical function of the gap. So a relative specifier can have the inflection that the word in the gap would have in a canonical clause. Okay? So 2 things. We can get inflection on the relative specifier according to what gap it's associated with. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the lower down the accessibility hierarchy we get, the harder it is to make a relative clause with that position. Okay, so there is experimental evidence in favour of this and so forth. Okay, so those were the bits of toolkit I wanted to introduce you to, and now I want to talk about relative clauses cross-linguistically. And the reason I want to talk about relative clauses cross-linguistically is that English has weird relative clauses, but English has weird relative clauses because the Indo-European languages have weird relative clauses, and I want to talk about the dimensions of weirdness. Okay. So, Mark de Vries, in his PhD thesis, checked out the number of languages that had relative specifiers and compared them with languages that didn't have relative specifiers. And he discovered this statistically significant fact that relative specifiers are found way more commonly in Indo-European languages than they're found in non-Indo-European languages. So only 7 out of 132 languages that weren't Indo-European in his sample had relative specifiers, whereas there were half as many, again, languages with relative specifiers in the Indo-European languages, 27 versus 13. So the 27 languages with relative specifiers include German and Dutch and English. and the languages in Indo-European without relative specifiers include Welsh and Norwegian and Icelandic. To make sure that we're all on the same page, our criteria were that we were talking about a headed relative clause of the kind that I've already introduced, that there was a gap in that relative clause, that there wasn't another pronoun occupying the gap, and that the relativizer met the definition I've already given of what a relative specifier was. Okay, so those were the findings that De Vries came up with, and they meet these criteria here. So this leads to a question then, and the question is a typological question, and it goes something like this. Exactly how Indo-European are relative specifiers? Because although non-Indo-European languages with relative specifiers do exist, they include Finnish, Hungarian, Bambara, which is spoken in West Africa, and Georgian, which is Caucasian, they're rare enough for relative specifiers to form part of what Cymru calls a European type. And they're typically found in situations proximal to Indo-European languages. I'm going to put the European type bit to one side, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to argue that relative specifiers are an Indo-European phenomenon. Okay, we'll be able to account for the rest of it later. This, though, can't be simply accounted for in the history of the Indo-European languages because there weren't headed relatives with relative specifiers in Proto-Indo-European. Now, of course, I assert this on the evidence of James Claxon's work, not on the evidence of my own. But Claxon points out that you get relative clauses in early Latin, in Sanskrit and Hittite, which were adjoined, which were not embedded. And Kiparsky asserts that these are syntactically similar to free relatives. Okay, so we don't find headed relatives with relative specifiers in early Indo-European languages. One type of Indo-European relative clause that we find, this is common in Hittite and it's also common in Latin, is marked by these, the descendants of these forms. These are reconstructions. They're typically left adjoined and restrictive, possibly generalizing. Another kind, which you get in Homeric Greek, has this sort of reconstructed thing in the relevant position, is typically right adjoint and is typically non-restrictive. So although Proto-Indo-European probably had relative specifiers in free relatives, it didn't have relative specifiers in the modern European sense. It didn't have relative specifiers in these headed relative clauses that we're talking about. So the broad research question is something like this. Why do relative specifiers keep on evolving in Indo-European languages when they're so rare outside of the Indo-European language family? Okay, that's the research question. English poses the same question as Indo-European, but in microcosm. English has had two different series of relative specifiers in its history, and this is despite their typological rarity. So English has evolved these things twice, or these things have evolved twice in English, but they're so jolly rare, you wouldn't expect them to evolve once. Okay? Old English used inflected demonstratives as relative specifiers, so this is what modern standard German and Dutch do these days. And then the WH relative specifiers that I've been talking about emerged in Middle English. And as Henry tells us, demonstratives and WH specifiers are the two most common sources of headed relatives. Headed relatives with inflected demonstratives are already attested in the earliest English texts, but they decline with, they disappear with the loss of the Old English case system. The headed relatives emerge soon after the decline of the inflected demonstratives. Now, one thing you can't say, one thing that we have to observe is there's about a 100-year gap between these two different things. The headed WH relatives start to emerge about 100 years after we lose the inflected demonstratives. So there's a gap in the history. One of the points of the lecture is to show how linguists argue things. So I'm going to set up an argument and I'm going to argue against it. And the argument I'm setting up is a functionalist argument, and it claims this. The pattern, and I'm setting it up because I've subscribed to it in the past and I've worked out that I'm wrong. So if you're wrong, then you should put your hands up and confess. This is my confession. The pattern looks like it reflects a kind of functional need. The grammar of English is set up in such a way that it should have relative specifiers. And when it loses a set of relative specifiers, it casts around until it finds something else that it can recycle, and it rams them into the system in the place that they're needed. This argument is set up by the distribution of the gap. And it's that WH specifiers enter the relative clause system low down on the accessibility hierarchy, so they enter the system in places where it's hard to relativize, okay, these low positions, low accessibility positions. And so it makes it easier to relativize in those positions. I think that's the argument. And I'll look at the evidence for this on the next slide. There is an alternative claim that we can dismiss this out of hand. The alternative claim is that headed WH relatives could have been borrowings from Latin or French. But that makes no sense in terms of what we know about the sociolinguistics of Sprachbund situations, and it's not supported by the details. Latin and French had WH relatives right the way across the accessibility hierarchy, so there's no obvious reason why English speakers would have borrowed or introduced them low on the hierarchy and not high on the hierarchy. It's just irrational. Okay, so here's the analysis of the data. This red line here shows WH relative specifiers entering the English language system, and it's the steepest, fastest curve. It happens first in prepositional phrases. So in whom we trust, that sort of thing. Okay? So that's the earliest. The next line, second steepest curve, and coming second in the history, is adverbial elements. So that's adjuncts. That's very low down in the accessibility hierarchy. So these two things are low on the accessibility hierarchy. The third line, which is hard to see in green along here, which is much shallower, is WH specifiers entering the system in object position, and the bottom line is WH specifiers entering the system in subject position. So they enter low on the accessibility hierarchy first and high on the accessibility hierarchy last. The functionalist argument has something like this structure. Positions low on the accessibility hierarchy are difficult to relativize on. Having inflections makes it easier to process or fill a gap relationship, and therefore these relatives were introduced to the system to enable speakers to relativize low on the accessibility hierarchy. There's a circularity to that, and it also doesn't explain how come most languages get by just fine with no relative specifiers at all. Remember Mark de Vries's data, most languages just don't have them, especially out of Indo-European. It also doesn't explain how English got by for 100 years without relative specifiers before it decided to go and invent a whole bunch of the things all over again. So it's a non-explanatory argument. It's an argument that we want to leave aside and see if we can find a better argument. And here, the better argument works out something like this. There are structures which can be reanalyzed as headed relatives, and we can find them by looking at the distribution of WH forms in Old English. When we do this, we find that the free relatives of Old English are a possible source of the headed relatives. And this matters because the free relatives already have a WH pronoun in them, which is arguably a specifier. So it's already got the right word class, and it changes the research question. The research question is now no longer, how come English keeps inventing these WH relative specifiers? And it's now, okay, so it's got relative specifiers and free relatives, and in English, it's possible to go from being a free relative to being a headed relative, but that's blocked in other languages for some reason. So it changes the research question somewhat. So here's an example of an Old English free relative here, which occupies an argument position. It's the object of the verb for observed here. So that's just a simple vanilla example of an Old English free relative with a WH relative specifier at this point. If we look at the Old English data, we find that they behave exactly as predicted. They don't only behave as arguments, as in this example, but they can also be in apposition to an argument. So this example here, swether he willa, here is in apposition to good or evil earlier on in the clause. And this example here, swa what swa, is in apposition to things over here. So we do get these appositional structures in Old English. And those appositional structures give us the kind of structure which allows us to imagine these relative clauses being reanalyzed as headed relative clauses. Moreover, we can find definite interpretations of these free WH relatives, so they're not generalizing. And here are some examples here. Then I said to him, show me the tomb where I laid you, show me the tomb where I buried you. Okay, so that's definitely a definite expression. It's got to be definite. And it also, where I laid you, modifies tomb. It looks actually like a restrictive modifier already. And here we've got where I buried him, which is in an argument position. So led him to where I buried him, something like that. So we've got the right structures already in Old English. The research question has changed somewhat, though. It's how come free relatives in English, and presumably in the other Indo-European languages, get reanalyzed as headed relatives. We see, though, that Old English WH relatives can receive definite interpretations, appear clause finally, and appear in apposition to another noun phrase, and this makes them a likely source for headed relatives, which do the same things. So we've got a plausible language internal source for post-nominal WH relatives. The change looks something like this. The WH word in the free relative is analysed as a head, and it gets reanalyzed, so the lexical network that's associated with it says that it can be the dependent of a nominal head. Okay? So it's a reanalysis then of members of this particular word class. And that then accounts for the fact that it spreads through the different members of the word class, item by item. They don't all move all at the same time, and that's exactly what happens, as we'll see a little bit later on. But what about the typology? So why are there relative specifiers in Indo-European? And the answer is because the Indo-European languages have these correlative structures, and the correlative structures are a kind of free relative. The pronouns in the correlative structures get reanalyzed as free relative specifiers, and then the free relatives get reanalyzed as headed relatives. So you see a lot of little changes leading to this typological mess that we call English. But each change is a perfectly ordinary small change at the given step in the history of the language when it happens. The account also works for non-Indo-European languages. If you look at Bambara, what you find is that they have correlatives. So they have the necessary antecedents to go through the same evolutionary processes. And we can also account for why Cymru thinks that relative specifiers are a European Sprachbund phenomenon. European phenomenon, sorry. It's because of the sociolinguistics of a Sprachbund, where you would expect there to be massive bilingualism and everybody speaks everybody else's language. So in Hungarian, which is surrounded by Germanic and Slavic languages, you have a bunch of bilingual people all using each other's languages, and in those sorts of situations, then you get transfers between the grammar. In Nenets, which is in the same language family as Hungarian, that doesn't happen because Nenets is spoken somewhere in Siberia and there aren't any people there. How should we understand the story? Like this. There's never been a time in the history of English when the relative system was well designed, or logical, or devoid of exceptions. But it's always worked well enough. And in this respect, English is no different from Latin and it's no different from Bambara. And the reason for this is that grammars evolve and that evolution produces imperfect design. Okay, so everybody with a dodgy back can bear this in mind, right? But it's also about the nature of language. Languages don't need grammar police, because the mess, variability, and all of these sorts of things, they're just intrinsic. They're inherent to how language works. They're simply part of it. And we handle that. We work with it. So what should we tell the children? Let's come back to prescriptivism. I said earlier that the evolutionary story accounts for the fact that the WH words enter the relative specifier of headed relative clauses in English word by word. In my variety of English, the word what hasn't made it into headed relative clauses. So I can say 10a, that's perfectly grammatical for me. I can say what I said annoyed them, but I can't say 10b, the thing what lurked in the cellar, because the thing what lurked in the cellar is ungrammatical in my variety of English. There are, of course, dialects of English where it's perfectly grammatical, but the WH words entered the relative system of English, lexical item by lexical item, and standardization happened in the history of English before what made it into the system of headed relatives. Okay? Okay, so I speak standard English. It's an irrational system, though, because instead of what in these relatives, we use which. But consider the semantics of what, and compare the semantics of what with the semantics of which. I wonder which she bought versus I wonder what she bought. The semantics of which clearly indicate that the question is set up against a choice set of some kind. You know that there's a set of items out there that she's selected from, and you're wondering which of that set of items she's chosen. Whereas in I wonder what she bought, you're not setting up a set of items that she's picking from. It can be anything. The semantics of what make more sense in relative clauses, I think, the etymology of what makes more sense in relative clauses than the etymology of which. Standard English has invented an etymologically irrational system because what didn't penetrate the headed relative clause system soon enough to be part of Standard English. So standardization itself has introduced a suboptimal system. And now pronouns. Now, I know it's a lot of slides ago and many, many minutes ago, but we talked about pronouns like him as grammatical subjects. And we've also all heard examples like between you and I. And for what it's worth, in my variety of English, 13 is grammatical. It's perfectly fine to say, me and Caro have 2 sons. Is that okay for you, Meg?
Not at all.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay. What's that about? Why is it that these pronouns behave in these various ways? I think the answer is that English has a default pronoun, which is the object form, and that we don't really know how to use case inflection particularly well in English. And so we don't really know how to use the subject forms unless we're instructed or unless it's blindingly obvious. Now, it's blindingly obvious that you have to use I in a finite clause when it's the subject of a finite verb. But it's not blindingly obvious, for example, when it's in a coordination. So English speakers get really bad at learning how to use I in coordinations and remembering that you can only use I in a coordination when that whole coordination is the subject of a finite verb and not when it's the object of a preposition like between. Because we don't really know our pronouns in English. We're really lousy at them. And then there's whom. So, I mean, I could have put more examples than this up, but I mean, the question marks reflect my own judgments, okay? So I wonder who we gave it to. I think that's grammatical for everybody, and that's default and normal, I think. I wonder whom he gave it to. I put 1 question mark in front of it, but I might have put 2, or I might have put more marks of stigma there, because that actually seems a bit weird to me, but nevertheless, I grant that it won't be weird to everybody. I wonder to who he gave it. You've got the 2 piped with whom. That makes more sense, but it's so phenomenally pompous sounding that there's a stylistic constraint against saying something like that. It just doesn't sound like human. But you can say, to whom did he give it over here? And the reason I give these examples is that I think they illustrate my general point about pronouns, which we really don't know how to use the vestigial case system that we find on the pronouns of English. And here are some examples showing just that. And you'll be glad to hear that this is my last slide. So what should we tell the children? Well, I think we should tell the children that language can be studied systematically, that their own varieties of English are interesting, and that their own varieties of English can be more logical than standard English, not least because the thing what lives in the cellar is perfectly grammatical in some varieties of English. But we should also tell the children that they need to have mastery over standard English and it's worth acquiring. But that standard English has got nothing to do with the ridiculous precepts like the one about split infinitives or the one that says that WH relatives shouldn't be restrictive. And grammar itself has even less to do with these precepts because grammar is this messy, complex, adaptive, evolutionary thing. Thank you.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.